My name is Professor Sipho Shabalala. I spent a number of years in the 70s in Zambia, almost about 9 years, and I schooled there at UNZA, University of Zambia. Indeed, this year Zambia is going to be, or they are beginning to get into gear with respect to the celebration of the 60 years of independence, of self-determination and freedom of the people of Zambia. And indeed, we are informed that this time celebrations are going to take place at all the centers and quarters of the country. And this indeed is important insofar as it will make everyone in Zambia to be part and parcel of the celebrations of 60 years of the country's independence and freedom. And also, the country is also going to receive the Chinese president, and the relationship between China and Zambia obviously have been growing very well. And it is important that Zambia, among other things, should diversify her relationship with different countries of the world. And therefore, that is important that the Chinese president is going to be also be part and parcel of the celebrations. As I was saying, therefore, that it is important for Zambia to diversify her relationship with different countries of the world, because resources, expertise, and relationships with different countries in the world are critical for the country's development. And of course, just in passing, one should remember that the basic position of Zambia at independence was a position of non-alignment. And therefore, that is an expression of that non-alignment in ensuring that Zambia opens up different relationships with different countries. That said, however, I would like to rather pose another approach in looking at the 60 years of independence celebration. That notwithstanding that this will be a celebration, but the core considerations in respect of this year should be that of self-introspection as a country. This is to say that Zambians, their leaders in different areas of human endeavor as well as government, should engage in self-introspection as a collective as to exactly what has happened in the country within the last 6 years. This is important from the point of view that we would be in a position in so doing to identify where the right, correct things were done, and where wrong things and decisions were made. And that is important. This is critical and important. And we should remember that when all else is considered, the purpose of governance, the purpose of running an independent country is to promote and improve human welfare. The quality of life of the Zambian people is the critical index of whether or not the country has been successful or not. And here I am using the concept of Human Development Index that may come up in different specifics, whether you are going to be dealing with the issues of development of human capability, skills, knowledge, technology, whether you are going to be dealing it from the position of what has been happening in economic development in different sectors of the economy, in dealing with the issues of agricultural development, etc. Because all these must be understood to be nothing else but means to an end. And the end is the quality of life of the Zambian people. That should be, and then we should therefore be in a position to develop appropriate indices that will say what is the index with regard to A, health of the people, nutrition of the people. What can we say in terms of acquisition of skills and of the people, development of appropriate science and technology capabilities, with regard to developing new knowledge and worldviews in the country, with regard to the issues of poverty, elimination of poverty, equality, attainments, overall well-being of the people of Zambia, that can of course be divided into different components, and using particular yardsticks will therefore be in a position to evaluate as to what exactly has been happening. So what I'm trying to be proposing here, fellow Africans, fellow Zambians, is that this should be in fact the trust, that recognizing the fact that that country has enjoyed this independence for 60 years, critical what has happened with regard to the quality of life of the people of that area. This should not necessarily be an issue of pointing accusations against each other, this political party, this what and what. But it should be considered from the desktop of Zambia and the Zambian people. I recall very well that the major motive slogan at the time of independence of Zambia was, I quote, "Zambia on the sun." And the issue of Zambia on the sun was a highly motivated and motivated statement. It was challenging the Zambian people and therefore their leaders and government that Zambia was supposed to locate itself on successful nations. The sun here was a symbol of success. Putting Zambia on the sun was the equivalence of saying putting Zambia at the altar of success. And therefore, there were a number of areas of this success that were therefore mooted. We all know that, for instance, Zambia entered independence at a very low level of overall development indices, be it economic, human, environmental, etc. Because while Zambia was part of the federation, most of the resources that were developing that federation went to what was then called Southern Rhodesia, because that is where there was a heavy settlement of British people. On the part of Zambia, of course, this was not the case. And one would remember that the areas of development in that part of the world, that is Zambia, was along the line of rail, Livingstone up to the Copperbelt. And outside the line of rail, there was economic doldrum. There was highly levels of underdevelopment in all respects, economic, human, etc. And therefore putting Zambia on the sun, among other things, was to ensure that the colonial status quo had to be changed. And one of the measures that were undertaken initially, obviously, was the development of human resources. Zambia had to have educated members of the nation. And therefore, the University of Zambia was established, and the government of Zambia poured resources to ensure, first and foremost, that the country did have that university producing a lot of teachers who will then enable the country to open up in almost all the provinces secondary schools, and of course enlarging the number of primary schools. So the issue of education, in order to utilize educated, skilled Zambians to become the centers, the instruments of development of the country, was critical. And secondly, as I've already indicated, outside the line of rail, there was what we'll call economic doldrum. And therefore, the concept of development in Zambia went hand in hand with the desirability and the necessity of developing rural areas. And accordingly, that time initially, you will find that the biggest ministry in Zambia was the Ministry of Rural Development. Because the concept of development in Zambia was expressed, or could best be expressed, via the development of rural areas. And that is important. And hence that ministry was the most powerful ministry. And most of even the infrastructure development, water, transport, etc., agriculture, were all part and parcel, and they were coordinated within that ministry. What does that tell us? It tells us, therefore, that when we organized the government, a hegemonic agenda, a hegemonic project around which the country is aiming to achieve is critical. And once that agenda has been identified, as people will say, once the strategy and its goals has been identified, we then move into the issue, how do we structure ourselves to realize the objectives of that particular agenda. Here then we deal with how the governments get configured. Which ministry are going to be there? Which ministry are relevant? Which ministry are not relevant for now? Maybe they will be relevant tomorrow, as the case may be. Where should be the national resources be directed, as a matter of fact? So that's the critical point. And that point in time at the beginning in the 70s, in the 60s into the beginning of the 70s, was the trust. And it is important, therefore, that as we do this introspection into the past, we take into account those issues, the trust, and ask ourselves as how far did that initial hegemonic agenda took the country? And at what point did it falter, if it faltered? That is critical. Because going forward after the 60 years, the country should not repeat the errors of yesterday. In other words, 60 years must be considered as years of learning. That is the critical message. Years of learning. What have we learned as Zambians, such that this is what we think was the right thing to do, which therefore needs to be done, expanded, and recharged? What was wrongly done, such that we don't repeat what was wrongly done? That is what the issues of evaluation, introspection is about. And I must say, therefore, that trust was there and it produced results. But through time, in general, things started faltering. I'll just remember a couple experiences and symbols when now things were beginning to be faltering. As an example, I recall one time when in the 70s, mid-70s or so, Maiza Shona was addressing a meeting in Lusaka. And as he was addressing the meeting, and the women who were part of that gathering, when he was asking them, and of course in the usual thing that one Zambia, instead of them coming and saying one nation, they merely say, Njala Yeka. And that was the response from the crowd that was being addressed by Maiza Shona. And another occasion that is symbolic of the feelings of the people. Then there was this aspect, the cry from the government asking the people to tighten their belts. Tighten your belt. See, things are not well. Tighten your belt. And the people responded, yo, the only problem here we have is that with us, the belts are against our bones. So tightening the belt to us means breaking our bones. Now, to me, I'm just quoting this to indicate that at some point, the masses of the people were providing the government with the message to the effect that no, life is beginning to be difficult for us. And I think, therefore, when we do this evaluation as part of evaluating what has been happening for the last 60 years, these are some of the areas that are critical to be evaluated. And it's important, again, to realize that I've already indicated that the rural areas, Zambia was essentially, could be essentially called a rural area. I know I'm using this term difficultly because what's rural, what's urban? I remember one lecturer at the university, professor in sociology. He said, I understand that there's something called rural development, urban development, but my problem is, right here in Lusaka, I see a lot of rural areas. So where is this demarcation between rural and urban? How do you differentiate between the two? What are the indices that you are utilizing? And I am saying, therefore, when I'm using this myself, I remember that even in reality, whether we're economists or sociologists and etc., the concept of rural versus urban sometimes can be a dicey situation. But indeed, there are certain indices that could be utilized for this thing. But if for instance, therefore, the rural areas is because now, let me start by saying that part of the valuations that will probably, when made, that some of the results that will come out will of course place that Zambia, interestingly, has become, in the region here, South Africa leads with regard to inequality. And it is followed by Namibia. And Zambia is taking a third position. Now, we can explain how Tanzania, South Africa, if you will, how Namibia is experiencing these high levels of inequality. Because these two countries have got a high level of settler, of colonial settlers. For instance, the land in Namibia and here is highly concentrated, I mean the ownership is highly concentrated around the former settlers. In Namibia, the Germans, the Afrikaners. In this country, in South Africa, Zambia, the Afrikaners are also heavily positioned with respect to land ownership. Now, when I ask myself as to really what then about Zambia, as far as I understand, and that's been the case, Zambian land belongs to the Zambian people. The land in Zambia is a common property of the Zambian people, and this is what it must be. But it is important that it must be made to remain so, because among other things, land is the basis for economic capital accumulation, what sometimes is called a bottom-up development. And if this capability is lost with the concentration of land in the hands of the few people, then you haven't seen anything. Issues of poverty, inequality in the country will be highly scaled upwards. And therefore, as an example, again, in looking back, in the 70s, in order to avoid a situation whereby the owners of land, Zambians owners of land, when getting credit from the commercial, from the banks, they should not end up using land as a collateral. And when they then fail to pay, they will therefore have their land being confiscated by the creditors. A law was therefore passed, which had what was called a floating chart. And this floating chart therefore provided conditions whereby if the person who had borrowed money is unable to pay, the creditor, the commercial creditors will not take the land as a collateral, because that was prohibited. But the collateral will be anything that will be available at the land, on the land at the time the credit was due to be paid. In other words, it was called a floating chart, meaning that this collateral will be floating over the land and it will crystallize on whatever will be on top of the land, not the land itself. And this is critical, and because it was trying to prevent a situation where Zambians will become to be alienated from their land, because that alienation will have led to highly skewed and increased poverty. What am I saying, therefore? And summarizing what I'm trying to say here is, I've already said that it's important that Zambia, we all must celebrate. Even as individuals, we celebrate our birthday. But in so doing, my advice is that notwithstanding the importance of the celebrations, the most critical thrust of what needs to be done is that one of introspection, looking back and say what has happened in the country within the last 60 years. What is good that has happened? What is not good that has happened? And why did things happen the way they did? And in terms of the primacy of the importance of human quality of life, indexed differently, it becomes very important that the quality of life of the Zambian people should be a critical measure. And if it becomes a critical measure, therefore all hands should be on board to ensure that the quality of life of the people of Zambia is improved. It should not be allowed to deteriorate. I've already indicated that there is high inequality now that is taking place, high poverty, and the rural areas has become the seat of poverty in the area. And indeed, it should be understood that this is not what should be allowed to happen, because Zambia is not a poor country. It should therefore not be. People of Zambia must not be turned into poor people in a non-poor country. I repeat, the people of Zambia must not be turned into being poor people in and on a non-poor country. So all measures must be made that this should be so. And in conclusion, one is aware that Zambia has been experiencing different constraints. Diseases, outbreaks of diseases, cholera, droughts, and strangely, sometimes drought follows heavy rains, and then from there, and the like. And we are aware also that the fiscal problems that the country is experiencing, government deficit has been increasing and is stubborn. Economic growth has been seen not to be robust. And one also must take into account, when one is looking at this thing called economic growth, GDP. GDP, we must understand first how you measure it. And the way you measure it, in what way does it really reveal to you how the quality of life of the people is at any given time? Because sometimes some of the indices in these GDP measures do not at all help you to understand that. That's one thing. And furthermore, it is important to understand that economic growth by itself does not end up poverty. It depends. Growth of what sectors, in what areas, growth, who is involved and who is participating in that economic growth. That's what is in fact going to be in the position to end up problems. Not merely that we want to achieve, as the case may be, we're likely to have 4.2 GDP growth in this year. We hope to aim at 5.2 growth next year. Sometimes that could only be nothing else but economic mumbo jumbo with very little meaning in terms of life and the livelihoods of the Zambian people. And therefore, I'm saying that should be really in a position. I mean, we should really be in a position to be wary of some of these measurements. And of course, we are aware that once you are at a particular level of indebtedness, and you borrow and you have got your fiscal position, then you become susceptible to pressure from institutions like IMF asking you to do this or that, don't do that, don't do that. Like as we're experiencing in Kenya, the IMF, they've asked the Kenyan government to increase taxes so that it can improve its fiscal stability. And the people there, as obviously also with respect to Kenya, Kenya has been facing the same